The town of Troy, Missouri is the kind of place where time seems to slow down. It's a small, tight-knit community resting modestly outside the hustle of St. Louis, a place where people believe they know their neighbors. The streets wind past unassuming homes where lawns are neatly trimmed and American flags ruffle in the breeze. People see each other at church on Sundays, cheer for the local high school team on Friday nights, and settle disputes with a handshake. In Troy, trust is a currency, an accepted truth that the terrible things, the things you see on the news, are problems for the big city, not for them. Safety isn't just a feeling, it's a promise. It was in this peaceful setting that Elizabeth Betsy Faria and her husband Russ Faria were building their life. They were an ordinary Midwestern couple with ordinary hopes and anxieties. Betsy, in particular, was a bright flame. She had a loud laugh, an adventurous spirit, and a fierce loyalty to those she loved, especially her two daughters. Friends described her as someone who never met a stranger, a woman who could light up a room just by entering it. She worked at a local insurance firm, a stable job that helped anchor the family. But a shadow had fallen over the Faria home. A few years prior, Betsy had received a terrifying diagnosis: breast cancer. The disease had come and gone, a constant specter lingering at the periphery of their lives. But by 2011, that specter had returned with a vengeance. The illness had metastasized. The prognosis was grim. Betsy, ever the fighter, was facing the most difficult battle of her life. She was undergoing grueling chemotherapy treatments, and the illness was beginning to take its toll on her body, but it never touched her spirit. Russ Faria, her husband, was a simple man. He could be a bit rough around the edges, enjoyed his time with friends, played video games, and reveled in the simple pleasures of life. Their relationship, like any marriage under the immense strain of chronic illness, had its ups and downs. They argued, they reconciled. But to the outside world, they were a unit, facing the storm together. As Betsy's illness progressed, their small community rallied. Meals were delivered, prayers were offered, and offers of help came from all sides. And among this circle of friends and neighbors, one person seemed to stand out above all others, someone who appeared to be the epitome of selfless, steadfast support. Her name was Pamela Hupp. Pam Hupp, or Pam as everyone knew her, was a force of nature. She was bustling, always in motion, always organizing. She was the kind of woman who seemed to be everywhere, running school fundraisers, volunteering at church, and always the first to offer a shoulder to lean on. Pam and Betsy had worked together, and a close friendship had blossomed. When Betsy became ill, Pam took it upon herself to be the primary caregiver, confidant, and protector. At least, that was the appearance. Pam was the one who drove Betsy to her chemotherapy appointments. Pam was the one who sat with her for hours, listening to her fears and hopes. Pam was the one Betsy seemed to trust implicitly. Pam became intimately aware of the Faria family's finances, of the strains on their marriage, and of Betsy's deepest fears about what would happen to her daughters after she was gone. Pam had made herself indispensable. In the closing months of 2011, as Betsy's health declined, a significant topic arose: the financial future of her daughters. Betsy had a life insurance policy for $150,000. Originally, like most married couples, the beneficiary was Russ. But Pam, in her role as the trusted confidant, allegedly began to sow seeds of doubt. Pam would later tell a story that Betsy was worried Russ wouldn't manage the money wisely, that he might spend it frivolously. Betsy, according to Pam, wanted to ensure that money was set aside exclusively for the girls. Pam offered a solution. Why not change the beneficiary to Pam? Pam, the stable, responsible friend, would hold the money in a trust for the girls, ensuring it was used properly for their education and future. Just days before Christmas in 2011, Betsy, in a state of frail health and a mind perhaps clouded by medication, went to the local library with Pam. There, she signed the paperwork, making a fateful change. Pamela Hupp was now the sole beneficiary of Betsy Faria's $150,000 life insurance policy. The town of Troy, Missouri was about to lose its innocence. And for the Faria family, the nightmare was only just beginning. December 27, 2011, just 2 days after Christmas. A chill was in the Missouri winter air. Betsy, exhausted from a recent chemotherapy session, had spent the day at her mother's house. Pam Hupp, the devoted friend, picked her up in the evening to drive her home. It was a kind gesture, one of countless gestures Pam had made. Pam would later state that she dropped Betsy off, saw her into the house, made sure she was comfortable on the couch with a blanket, and then left around 7 p.m. Pam was the last person, by her own account, to see Betsy Faria alive. Russ Faria, meanwhile, was at a friend's house in Lake St. John. Lewis, a drive away. He and 4 other friends had a weekly ritual of getting together for game nights and movies. It was a much-needed escape from the grim reality of caring for a terminally ill spouse. Russ left his friend's home around 9 p.m. He stopped at a convenience store on the way back. He arrived at the house in Troy shortly after 9:40 p.m. The house was dark and strangely quiet. He called out for Betsy. There was no answer. The dim light from the living room revealed a horrific sight, a scene that would be forever burned into his mind. Betsy was on the floor, in a pool of drying crimson. She was motionless. In a state of panic and disbelief, Russ Faria called 911. That call, logged at 9:41 p.m., is the raw sound of a man whose world has just shattered. He was hysterical, sobbing, screaming. He told the dispatcher that his wife had harmed herself, that she had taken her own life. The cancer, he assumed, had finally become too much to bear. But when the first responders arrived, they knew instantly this was no act of self-harm. The scene was too violent, too devastating. Betsy Faria had been brutally attacked. There were numerous injuries on her body, dozens of them. A sharp object had been used repeatedly. The aftermath was spattered across the room. And there was a kitchen implement, a blade, still lodged, not in one of the primary injuries, but in her neck, an act that seemed almost like an afterthought. Detectives from the Lincoln County Sheriff's Office arrived, led by Captain Mike Lang. They stepped into a scene of complex, shocking violence, and in that chaos and horror, they landed on their first and only suspect, the man who was standing in the room, hysterical on the 911 call, Russ Faria. In investigative psychology, there is a concept known as confirmation bias. It is the tendency to search for, interpret, and favor information in a way that confirms one's pre-existing beliefs or hypotheses. That night, at the Faria household, the investigators developed a hypothesis. The husband did it. And every piece of evidence, every statement, every detail from that moment on was viewed through that lens. Russ Faria's behavior on the 911 call, his hysteria, was interpreted as manufactured remorse. His mention of self-harm was seen as a clumsy attempt to misdirect them. They saw a large man, capable of such a violent attack. They did not see a grieving husband. They saw a perpetrator. And then Pamela Hupp entered the picture. Alerted to her best friend's tragic passing, Pam rushed to the scene, projecting profound distress. Detectives, hoping she could provide some context, took her to the station for a statement. She did more than that. Pam Hupp didn't just provide context, she provided a full, neatly packaged narrative that pointed directly at Russ Faria. In the interview room, Pam painted a picture of a volatile marriage. She described Russ as hot-tempered, controlling, and increasingly aggressive. She relayed stories, allegedly told to her by Betsy, of Russ's rages. She insisted that Betsy was afraid of her husband. She told detectives that Betsy was planning to leave Russ but feared for her safety. Then, Pam delivered the detail that seemed to seal the deal. She claimed that just days earlier, Betsy had told her, "If anything happens to me, don't let Russ get away with it." For investigators already inclined to suspect Russ, this statement was like a smoking gun. It validated their hypothesis. Pam Hupp, the grieving best friend, the devoted caregiver, had no reason to lie. She was a credible witness. And when they asked about the $150,000 life insurance policy, Pam confirmed it. Yes, she was the beneficiary. But she quickly explained it was only because Betsy wanted her to hold the money for the girls. because Betsy was terrified Russ would spend it all. Strangely, instead of making the investigators look at Pam with suspicion, she was, after all, the one who stood to gain financially from Betsy's departure. It hardened their case against Russ. It gave Russ a motive. In the investigators' minds, the story formed. Russ, enraged at being cut out of the policy, flew into a rage and ended his wife's life. They had their suspect, they had their motive, and they had their star witness. The investigation, for all intents and purposes, was over the night it began. Russ Faria was arrested. As he was led away in handcuffs, he was in a state of profound shock. He couldn't understand what was happening. He had just lost his wife, and now he was being accused of her passing. He insisted on his innocence. He had an alibi, 4 friends who would swear he was miles away until 9 p.m. His convenience store receipt showed him there just before arriving home. The timeline was impossibly tight. The investigators looked at the scene. Given the level of violence and the amount of blood, the attacker would have been covered in it. Russ Faria's clothing, when he was taken into custody, was completely clean. No traces, no sign of a struggle, nothing. But it didn't matter. The confirmation bias was in full control. He had enough time, they reasoned, about 40 minutes, to drive home, commit the horrific act, clean himself up perfectly, change his clothes, and then call 911, pretending he had just found her. Joel Schwartz, a seasoned defense attorney from St. Louis, was assigned to Russ Faria's case. From the very beginning, Schwartz was stunned by the holes in the prosecution's case. Russ's alibi was rock solid. 4 credible witnesses, a time-stamped receipt. The lack of forensic evidence on Russ was a massive problem. And on top of it all, there was the glaring, unmissable issue, Pamela Hupp. Schwartz couldn't understand why the investigators weren't focused on the woman who stood to gain $150,000. He started digging. He discovered that Pam Hupp was not just a passive friend. Her story was constantly changing. First, she told police she left Betsy's house at 7 p.m., but her cell phone tower data told a different story. It showed her phone was still in, or very near, the Faria property until 7:27 p.m., significantly later than she claimed. When pressed on this, her story shifted. Oh, she said, she had been sitting in her car in the driveway, emotional, composing an email. Schwartz also discovered another crucial detail. Pam Hupp, it seemed, had been trying to manufacture evidence. She had told police about a letter on Betsy's computer in which Betsy allegedly expressed her fear of Russ. When police couldn't find it, Pam tried to help. It appeared she had tried to create such a document herself after the fact. But perhaps the strangest part of Pam's testimony was about taking Betsy home. Betsy was terminally ill with cancer, so weak she could barely walk on her own. Yet Pam claims to have dropped Betsy, in her frail state, to walk into the dark house by herself. Later, she changed her story, saying she had helped Betsy inside and settled her on the couch. And then there was the matter of the insurance. Schwartz discovered that Pam had called the insurance company repeatedly in the days following the incident, eager to know when she could collect her money. Joel Schwartz took all of this to the Lincoln County prosecuting attorney, Leah Askey, later Leah Womack Cheney. He presented a compelling case that they had the wrong person. He pointed to Pam Hupp as the logical suspect, the one with the motive and the opportunity. But Askey and her team were unmoved. They were invested in their narrative. They believed Pam Hupp. They saw Schwartz as a typical defense attorney, trying to throw smoke and point fingers at an innocent woman. They proceeded to trial, charging Russ Faria with first-degree offenses. The trial of Russ Faria in November 2013 was an exercise in tragedy and absurdity. The prosecution, led by Leah Askey, presented their narrative. An angry husband, scorned over insurance money, had lashed out with brutal force. Their star witness was Pamela Hupp. On the stand, Pam was a masterful performer. She was calm, credible, and empathetic. She cried at the appropriate moments when describing her friendship with Betsy. She was resolutely certain as she recounted Betsy's fabricated warnings about Russ. She looked the jury in the eye and lied with compelling conviction. Joel Schwartz did everything he could. He hammered away at Pam's credibility. He pointed out the contradictions in her stories. He presented Russ's airtight alibi. His 4 witnesses testified clearly. He tried to tell the jury about the $150,000 life insurance policy. And that is when a controversial judicial decision sealed Russ's fate. Judge Chris Menemeyer, presiding over the trial, made a critical ruling. She ruled that Joel Schwartz could not introduce evidence that Pam Hupp was the beneficiary of the insurance policy. Her reasoning was that it would confuse the jury. It was a fatal blow. The jury was now left with the prosecution's story that Russ was an angry husband motivated by insurance money, without ever being told that it was the prosecution's own star witness who was actually getting that money. Russ's motive, according to the prosecution's theory, was removed, yet they were still allowed to argue it. The jury deliberated. They came back with a verdict: guilty. Russ Faria collapsed. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He had been convicted of a crime he did not commit, while the person actually responsible, Pamela Hupp, sat in the courtroom, presumably counting her $150,000. Shortly after the trial, Pam collected the insurance payout. She used a portion of it to buy a new home. Justice in Lincoln County had failed, utterly. Russ Faria was sent to a maximum security state prison. His life, as he knew it, was over. He had lost his wife, he had lost his freedom, and he was alienated from Betsy's daughters, who now believed he was the one who had taken their mother from them. But Joel Schwartz did not give up. He was haunted by the injustice. He knew Russ was innocent. He continued to dig, filed appeals, and worked tirelessly to overturn the conviction. He knew the key was Pam Hupp. Media attention also began to build. NBC's Dateline took an interest in the case, particularly correspondent Keith Morrison. Questions began to be asked nationally. How could a man with such a strong alibi be convicted? Why was the jury never told about the real insurance beneficiary? When Pam Hupp was put in front of the Dateline cameras, the world got to see what Joel Schwartz had seen. A woman who had an answer for everything, perhaps too many. She was slick, rehearsed. When cornered on contradictions, she would giggle, change the subject, or play the victim. She did not come across as a grieving friend. She came across as someone hiding something. Russ Faria's appeal finally made its way through the courts. And this time, justice prevailed. The appellate court was shocked by what it read, particularly Judge Menemeyer's decision to exclude the critical evidence about Pam Hupp. They overturned Russ Faria's conviction and ordered a new trial. Furthermore, in a stunning turn of events, Judge Menemeyer was later removed from the case after revelations about her personal relationships with the prosecutor, Leah Askey, cast serious doubt on her impartiality. In November 2015, nearly 4 years after Betsy's passing, Russ Faria was back in court. This time, there would be no jury. The case would be decided by a new judge, Judge Stephen Omer, in a bench trial. Leah Askey, despite mounting criticism, remained the prosecutor. She continued her pursuit of Russ Faria, clinging to her original theory. Pam Hupp was, once again, the star witness. But this time, Joel Schwartz was allowed to fight with both hands. He was able to present every single piece of evidence regarding Pam Hupp. The $150,000 policy, the conflicting cell tower data, the lies, the changing stories. He painted an undeniable picture of a woman with motive, opportunity, and a pattern of deception. Pam Hupp, on the stand for a second time, was less steady. She was hostile, argumentative, and far less believable. The veneer of the grieving best friend was cracking. After all the evidence was presented, Judge Omer did not take long. He delivered his verdict, not guilty. Russ Faria was free. After 1,459 days of wrongful imprisonment, he walked out of the courtroom breathing the air of a free man. But it was a bittersweet victory. He had his exoneration, but he had lost 4 years of his life. He had lost his wife. And true justice had still not been served. The person responsible for Betsy's departure was still at large. And Pamela Hupp, The woman who had pocketed $150,000 walked out of the courtroom still a free woman. Following Russ Faria's exoneration, a logical person might expect the Lincoln County Sheriff's Office and the prosecuting attorney's office to immediately open a new investigation into Pamela Hupp. That did not happen. They were too invested in their conviction of Russ. To admit they were catastrophically wrong was to admit incompetence or worse, willful misconduct. They simply let the case go cold. As far as they were concerned, the Betsy Faria case was closed. As far as the world was concerned, it was an outrage. But Pamela Hupp was not the kind of person to quietly recede into the shadows. She had tasted what it was like to get away with the ultimate act, and it seemed she developed a sense of invincibility. She also had a problem. The $150,000 in insurance money was running out, and the media attention, particularly from Dateline, had made her a pariah in her own community. And there was another matter. In 2013, while Russ Faria was awaiting his first trial, another tragedy had befallen Pam. Her mother, Shirley Newman, 77, had experienced a fatal event. It happened at Shirley's senior living apartment. Pam was the last person to see her alive. Pam told police that her mother, who was recovering from a minor back procedure, had fallen from her third-story balcony to the ground. It was ruled a tragic accident, but there were strange details. Shirley's blood alcohol content was unusually high, far higher than a woman of her age recovering from a procedure would normally have. And Pam, once again, was the financial beneficiary, collecting a significant life insurance payout, reportedly around $500,000. At the time, it was seen as just a tragedy, but in the light of Russ Faria's exoneration, journalists and amateur sleuths began to look back at Shirley Newman's demise. It looked terribly suspicious. But it was Pam's next act that would be her undoing. An act so desperate and bizarre, it was almost unbelievable. In August 2016, in St. Charles County, not far from Lincoln County, a 911 call was placed, this time from Pam Hupp's home. She was hysterical, claiming a man had broken into her house, chased her with a blade, and she had been forced to defend herself, using her firearm. When police arrived, they found a man on Pam's floor who had passed. He was Louis Gumpenberger, 33. He was both physically and mentally disabled as a result of a severe brain injury from a car accident years prior. Pam Hupp told an elaborate story. She said Gumpenberger had jumped out of a car, followed her into her home, and demanded Russ's money. She claimed he said he was sent there to retrieve the insurance money from Betsy, money that Russ believed was his. She said he had a blade and threatened her. In the struggle, she managed to get her weapon and end the threat. It was a story designed to do one thing: retroactively justify her original narrative about Russ Faria. It was a blatant attempt to paint Russ as a criminal mastermind who was now sending operatives after her, the innocent victim. But this time, Pam Hupp was not dealing with the Lincoln County authorities. The St. Charles County investigators immediately saw the holes in her story. Why would Louis Gumpenberger, a man with severe physical and mental impairments, be chosen as an enforcer? How could he have possibly overpowered Pam? And the whole story about Russ's money sounded far too convenient. They investigated. They found $9 in Gumpenberger's pocket, along with a note that appeared to be instructions. They tracked Gumpenberger's movements before the incident. They found he had no connection to Russ Faria whatsoever. Then they found a witness, a woman, who told them an astonishing story. Just hours before the incident, Pam Hupp had been impersonating a Dateline producer. She had been driving around a low-income area, trying to recruit someone to reenact a 911 call for an upcoming segment, promising to pay them thousands. They realized Pam had tried to lure this woman into her car, presumably to carry out the same plan. When that woman refused, Pam found an easier target, Louis Gumpenberger. She had picked him up, promised him money, and driven him to her home. The investigators reconstructed what happened. Pam had written the note in Gumpenberger's pocket herself. She had called 911 before Gumpenberger was even in the house. She had taken the life of an innocent, impaired man, all to bolster her lies and frame Russ Faria once again. It was an act of unimaginable desperation and cruelty. Pam's cell data showed her in Gumpenberger's neighborhood just before the incident. The blade found on Gumpenberger was traced to a local Dollar Tree, and the receipt was found in Pam's home. The house of cards had collapsed. Pamela Hupp was arrested for the first-degree passing of Louis Gumpenberger. Faced with an undeniable mountain of evidence, this time from a competent investigation, Pam Hupp knew she was trapped, but she had one last move. In 2019, to avoid a trial and the possibility of capital punishment, Pam Hupp entered an Alford plea. An Alford plea is a strange American legal plea where the defendant does not admit to the act, but admits that the prosecution has enough evidence to convict them. It is, essentially, a way of saying, I didn't do it, but I know you can prove that I did. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for the passing of Louis Gumpenberger. Finally, Pamela Hupp was behind bars, but it was for the wrong crime. Justice for Betsy Faria had still not been served. The arrest and conviction of Pam Hupp for the Gumpenberger incident sent shockwaves through Missouri. It exposed the gross incompetence of the original Lincoln County investigation. How could they have gotten it so wrong? The answer was disturbing. They were duped by a pathological storyteller, one whose narrative fit their own prejudices. They didn't investigate a crime. They built a case against an innocent man. The new Lincoln County prosecuting attorney, Mike Wood, was different. He re-examined the entire Betsy Faria case from scratch. Bolstered by the evidence from the Gumpenberger case, it was clear to him that Pam Hupp was responsible. In July 2021, nearly a decade after that fateful night, Pamela Hupp, already serving a life sentence, was formally charged with first-degree offenses for the passing of Betsy Faria. Prosecutor Wood did not mince words in his charging documents. He alleged that Pam Hupp took Betsy's life for the insurance money and then staged the scene to frame Russ Faria. He alleged her motive was pure, unadulterated greed. The case against Pam Hupp for the 2011 crime is still moving through the legal system, but the outcome seems inevitable. The web of deceit she so carefully wove for over a decade has finally closed in on her. The story of Pam Hupp is a terrifying cautionary tale. It is a story of how the criminal justice system can fail catastrophically when it chooses the easy path over the right one. It is a story of how confirmation bias can destroy lives. Russ Faria, after his freedom, filed a civil suit against the prosecutors and investigators who wrongfully imprisoned him. He received a settlement, but no amount of money could ever return the years he lost or erase the memory of being accused of his wife's departure. Betsy Faria, the center of it all, was a woman fighting an illness with courage, who, in her moment of greatest vulnerability, placed her trust in the most wrong person imaginable. She was not taken by her illness. She was betrayed by the greed of someone she called a friend. And Pamela Hupp, the manipulator, the storyteller, and the predator, was finally exposed. She was not a devoted caregiver or a loyal friend. She was a wolf in sheep's clothing, a figure whose cruelty was matched only by her own arrogance. She believed she was smarter than everyone, the police, the lawyers, and the journalists. And for a terrifyingly long time, she was right. The town of Troy, Missouri is not the same. The innocence is fractured, and the trust that was once so common is now hard-earned. The tragedy of Betsy Faria was not just a single passing. It was a painful exposure that the most frightening monsters are often the ones who smile at you, bring you a hot meal, and hold your hand when you are at your weakest, all while planning your demise. Frederick, Colorado, is a town that embodies the modern American dream. It's part of a sprawling suburban landscape north of Denver, where new, spacious homes are built in neat, winding communities with names that evoke tranquility and family. Windham Hill, Wren Valley, Sawtooth. It's a place designed for young families, for couples seeking refuge from the city, a place of sprawling parks, good schools, and wide, safe streets where children can ride their bicycles. The Rocky Mountains provide a majestic backdrop, a constant reminder of nature's beauty, while the homes themselves are monuments to domestic achievement. In 2018, the Watts family was the poster family for this dream. They lived in a large, 5-bedroom house on Saratoga Trail, a home they had built just a few years earlier. From the outside, their life looked like a perfectly curated social media feed, and in many ways, it was. Shanann Watts was a force of energy. At 34, she was vibrant, driven, and exceptionally outgoing. She was a natural salesperson, a promoter for a multi-level marketing lifestyle company called Lavelle, which sold patches, shakes, and supplements under the brand name Thrive. Shanann was a star promoter, constantly posting on Facebook, sharing live videos of her life, her family, and the products she believed in. Her posts were a cascade of positivity, motivational quotes, and loving tributes to her family. Her husband, 33-year-old Chris Watts, was her perfect counterpart. Where Shanann was talkative and effervescent, Chris was quiet, reserved, and seemed content to be the steady anchor to her balloon. He was handsome, famously shy, and appeared to be a completely devoted, hands-on father. In Shanann's videos, he was the dutiful husband, smiling softly, helping with the children, the reliable rock of the family. And then there were the children, the heart of their perfect world. Bella, 4 years old, was bright and sensitive, with her mother's expressive eyes. Celeste, 3, known as Cece, was the feisty, adventurous one, a tiny ball of energy. In the summer of 2018, the family was on the verge of expanding. Shanann was 15 weeks pregnant with their third child, a boy they had already named Nico. Shanann's Facebook feed painted a picture of pure domestic bliss. Videos of the girls singing, dancing, and shouting, "Daddy, you're my hero!" Photos of Chris rubbing her pregnant belly. Gushing posts about her husband. "I love this man. He's the best father us girls could ask for." This was the image they presented, and it was an image most of Frederick believed. They were the ideal family in an ideal town. But behind the facade of the $400,000 home, the matching outfits, and the Thrive patches, the foundation of the Watts family was crumbling. The financial pressure was immense. The large house came with a large mortgage, over $3,000 a month. They had car payments, student loans, and significant credit card debt. In 2015, they had filed for bankruptcy, listing over $70,000 in unsecured debt. Despite Shanann's success with Level and Chris's steady job as an operator for Anadarko Petroleum, they were living paycheck to paycheck, drowning in the effort to maintain the very image of success they projected. The personal cracks were just as deep. The couple had recently spent 6 weeks apart while Shanann and the girls visited family in North Carolina. This time apart had not, as Shanann hoped, made their hearts grow fonder. For Chris, it had offered a taste of a different kind of life, a life of freedom, a life without the constant pressure of family, finances, and fatherhood. It was a life he had begun to secretly explore. On the night of August 12, 2018, Shanann Watts returned home from a business trip to Arizona. Her friend and colleague, Nicole Atkinson, dropped her off at her Saratoga Trail home just before 2 a.m. on Monday, August 13th. The house was quiet. Chris was home, and the girls were asleep in their beds. The next morning, Nicole Atkinson began to worry. Shanann, who lived on her phone and was religious about her business, was unresponsive. She missed a scheduled doctor's appointment at 10 a.m., where she was supposed to hear her unborn son's heartbeat. Nicole tried texting, then calling. Every call went straight to voicemail. This was not like Shanann. By 12:10 p.m., a knot of dread in her stomach, Nicole Atkinson drove to the Watts home. Shanann's car was in the garage. She knocked on the door. No answer. She called the Frederick Police Department and requested a welfare check. An officer arrived and met a frantic Nicole. They were soon joined by Chris Watts, who arrived home from work. He had been in contact with Nicole, but seemed strangely calm, almost unconcerned. He told the officer he had no idea where Shanann was. He said they'd had an emotional conversation when she got home, but that was it. He unlocked the front door and let the officer inside. The house was pristine, eerily so. Shanann's purse was on the kitchen counter. Her cell phone was on the sofa table in the entryway. Her wedding rings on the nightstand. The beds were stripped, the sheets in a pile, but there was no sign of Shanann, Bella, or Celeste. Chris, under the watchful eye of the officer's body camera, moved through the house with a bizarre lack of urgency. He pointed out his wife's phone, her ring. He seemed more like a confused observer than a frantic husband and father. He mentioned that Shanann had talked about taking the girls to a friend's house to play, but he couldn't remember the friend's name. The officer, sensing something was wrong, asked a neighbor, Nate Trinastich, to check his home security camera. The camera was pointed directly at the Watts driveway. This single piece of technology would become the key to unraveling the entire case. Chris Watts stood on the neighbor's porch, watching the footage. He was visibly nervous, his hands clasped behind his back, rocking on his heels. The footage showed Chris's truck, and at 5:27 a.m. that very morning, the camera captured him backing his truck up to the garage. He was seen loading items into the truck bed. He was moving quickly, purposefully. He was the only adult seen leaving the house that morning. There was no sign of Shanann or his children. Watching the footage, Chris's story began to change. He now suggested Shanann must have left after he went to work. But the camera showed that was impossible. Shanann's car was still there. The Frederick Police Department knew this was no ordinary missing persons case. They launched a full-scale investigation, and the media descended on the quiet suburban street. On Tuesday, August 14th, less than 48 hours after his family vanished, Chris Watts stood on his own front porch, surrounded by news cameras, and gave one of the most chilling interviews in the history of true crime. He looked directly into the camera, his face a mask of mild concern. "Last night, I had an emotional conversation with her," he said. "I just want them back. I just want them to come back." He spoke of his children. "Bella, she's a little light. Cece, she's just a firecracker." He even forced a small, pained smile. "This house is not complete without anybody here. Please, just bring them back." There were no tears. There was no desperation. There was only a hollow, rehearsed performance. He was not a grieving husband. He was an actor playing a part, and he was failing. To the detectives watching, his demeanor was a massive red flag. They knew he was lying. The only question was why. The investigation moved at lightning speed. The FBI and the Colorado Bureau of Investigation were called in. They began to tear Chris Watts' life apart, and the image of the perfect family man disintegrated within hours. They pulled his phone records. They discovered he was involved in an intense affair with a co-worker from Anadarko, a 30-year-old woman named Nicole Kessinger. The affair had been going on for weeks, blossoming during the time Shanann and the girls were in North Carolina. This wasn't a casual fling. It was a serious relationship. Chris and Nicole were talking about a future, about building a life together. Chris had even told her he was in the process of separating from his wife. The motive, which had been a fog, snapped into sharp focus. It was the oldest motive in the book, a new life, a fresh start. But it was more than just love. It was financial. The investigators uncovered the full extent of the Watts' financial ruin. The bankruptcy, the maxed-out credit cards, the impending homeowners association lawsuit for non-payment, the $400,000 mortgage they were struggling to afford. Shanann's pregnancy, the addition of a third child, wasn't a joy for Chris. It was a financial anchor, one more chain holding him to a life he was desperate to escape. His mistress, Nicole Kessinger, represented everything he wanted: freedom, excitement, and a future with no debt and no responsibilities. His family, Shanann, Bella, Celeste, and the unborn Nico, had become obstacles. The detectives realized what the neighbor's security camera had shown them. Chris Watts hadn't just been loading tools into his truck at 5:27 a.m. He was loading the bodies of his family. On Wednesday, August 15th, detectives brought Chris Watts to the Frederick Police Station. They told him it was just a formality, a few more questions. They placed him in an interview room. They had one more card to play, a polygraph test. For hours, Chris sat with the examiner, repeating his story. He didn't know where they were. He loved them. He just wanted them home. The examiner strapped the sensors to him and began the test. The results were immediate and catastrophic.
The needles on the graph went wild. It was, the examiner would later say, one of the most deceptively indicated tests he had ever administered. Chris was lying about everything. The examiner confronted him. "You're not being honest with me, Chris. The test shows you are lying. You know what happened to them." Chris's calm facade began to crack. He put his head in his hands. The detectives entered the room. "It's time to tell the truth," they said. "We know you're involved." But Chris wasn't ready to tell the whole truth. He was going to construct one more horrifying lie. He asked to speak to his father, Ronnie Watts, who was waiting at the station.
The detectives, sensing a break, allowed it. With his father in the room, Chris began to weep. And then he spun his second story, a story designed to paint himself as a victim, a story that deflected the worst of the blame onto the woman he had already silenced. I came home," he stammered, "and I saw Shanann on the baby monitor. She was taking care of Cece." His father, confused, asked what he meant. She did something to them," Chris whispered, "and then I lost it. I went into a rage, and I did the same thing to her." It was a monstrous, calculated lie. He was claiming that Shanann, the devoted mother, had taken the lives of her own daughters, and that he, in a fit of righteous fury, had then taken hers. He was attempting to use his deceased wife as a shield for his own actions. The detectives, while privately disgusted, saw this as an opening. They pressed him. If that's what happened, where are they? Chris Watts finally broke. He agreed to show them. He told them he had taken his family to a remote oil work site, a place known as Survey 319, one of the many desolate, sprawling fields owned by Anadarko Petroleum. As the sun began to set on August 15th, a grim procession of law enforcement vehicles followed Chris Watts's truck down a long, dark dirt road. The site was miles from anything, a place of stark, industrial silence, punctuated only by the hum of machinery and the chirping of insects. Chris, now in handcuffs, walked the investigators to the site. He pointed to a patch of freshly disturbed earth near a cluster of oil tanks. "Shanann is right here," he said, his voice flat. As investigators began the delicate work of uncovering the shallow grave, Chris stared at the two massive 20-foot-tall oil tanks. "The girls," he said, "are in there." The horror of what he had done settled upon the investigators. He hadn't just disposed of his daughters. He had submerged them inside two separate tanks full of crude oil. The recovery operation was agonizing. It took hours. First, they recovered Shanann's body from the grave. She was wrapped in a sheet from their bed. Then, the crews had to drain the thick, toxic sludge from the tanks. The first tank was opened. A worker looked inside and recoiled. There, floating in the oil, was the small body of Bella Watts. They drained the second tank. There was Celeste. The little girls, aged 4 and 3, had been pushed through the 8-inch wide thief hatches at the top of the tanks. The autopsy would later reveal the full, heartbreaking story. Bella had bite marks on her tongue. She had fought for her life. The cause of their passing was determined to be asphyxiation. He had smothered them with his bare hands. Shanann and her unborn son, Nico, had also been asphyxiated. The why was now agonizingly clear. He hadn't snapped. This wasn't a fit of rage. This was a cold, calculated plan to annihilate his entire family, to clear the slate for a new life. He had taken their lives in their own home, one by one. He had then lived with them in the house for hours before loading them into his work truck, placing his daughters on the floor of the cab, and driving them, along with their mother, to the oil field where he worked every day. He had buried his wife, and then, in a final act of desecration, He had dropped his children, one by one, into the oil tanks, sealing their fate. He then went about his day, calling his daughter's school to unenroll them, texting his mistress, and playing the part of the concerned husband. The public revelation of the crimes sent a shockwave not just through Colorado, but across the world. The story was a toxic cocktail of everything that fascinates and repels the public: a beautiful family, a secret affair, and an act of unfathomable cruelty. The family that had looked so perfect on Facebook was revealed to be a lie, curated by a loving mother and destroyed by a sociopathic father. Nicole Kessinger, the mistress, came forward. She had contacted the police herself, sensing something was wrong when she saw Chris on the news. She was horrified. She told investigators that Chris had lied to her from the beginning, claiming he was at the end of a mutual separation. She had no idea he was a monster. The legal case against Chris Watts was overwhelming. The neighbor's camera, the phone records, the affair, the failed polygraph, and, most importantly, the discovery of the bodies at his direction. The Weld County District Attorney, Michael Rourke, announced he would be seeking the death penalty. On November 6, 2018, just 3 months after the events, Chris Watts appeared in court. To avoid a long, agonizing trial and the death penalty, he pleaded guilty to all 9 counts against him. 5 counts of first-degree offenses, 1 for each person, plus 2 for the children under 12, 1 count of unlawful termination of a pregnancy, and 3 counts of tampering with a deceased human body. The plea deal was made in consultation with Shanann's family, the Ruzaks. They did not want to endure a trial. They did not want to see the horrifying evidence. But most of all, they agreed to take the death penalty off the table for one reason. They wanted to ensure he would spend every single day of the rest of his life in a cell, thinking about what he had done. On November 19, 2018, the sentencing hearing took place. The courtroom was packed, the silence heavy with grief. Shanann's father, Frank Ruzak, spoke first. "I am heartbroken, and I have trusted you to take care of them, not take them from us," he said, his voice thick with emotion as he looked at Chris. "You disgust me. You heartlessly took their lives. They also loved you, but you took their lives." Shanann's mother, Sandra Ruzek, was defiant. "We loved you like a son. We are trusting you to take care of them. I have no idea who you are." She described her daughter as a fireball who dreamed of being a mom. The prosecutor, Michael Rourke, then delivered a chilling, detailed account of the crimes, revealing the full, cold-blooded nature of the plan. He described how Chris had smothered his daughters, how Bella had walked in after he had finished with Celeste, asking, "What's wrong with Cece?" He described how he had put his wife's body in the truck, and how his 2 daughters, still alive at this point, had been taken on that 45-minute drive to the oil field. The courtroom listened in stunned horror as Rourke explained that Chris had first taken Shanann's life. After his daughters saw him wrapping their mother in a sheet, he put them in the truck. He drove to Survey 319. He buried his wife. Then, one by one, he took his daughters from the truck. He smothered Celeste with her favorite blue blanket and dropped her into the tank. He returned for Bella, who, according to Chris's later confession, looked at him and said, "Daddy, no." He did the same to her. This was not a rage. This was an extermination. The judge, Marcelo A. Kopkow, his voice shaking with anger, delivered the sentence. "This is perhaps the most inhumane and vicious crime I have handled out of the thousands of cases I have seen." He sentenced Chris Watts to 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, plus 2 more life sentences to be served concurrently, 48 years for the unlawful termination of a pregnancy, and 36 years for tampering with the bodies. Chris Watts was led away in chains, destined to spend the rest of his natural life in prison. He was transferred to an out-of-state facility, the Dodge Correctional Institution in Waupun, Wisconsin, for his own safety. In the months and years that followed, the why continued to haunt the public. The answer, it seemed, was as shallow as it was horrifying. He did it for a fresh start. He did it to be with another woman. He did it to escape a $400,000 mortgage. From prison, Chris Watts gave more details in a chilling 5-hour-long interview with investigators. He finally admitted his second story, the one where he blamed Shanann, was a complete fabrication. He admitted he had been planning it. He said he had smothered Shanann in their bed after she confronted him about the affair. He said that when he was loading her body into the truck, his daughters woke up and came downstairs. This detail made the crime even more monstrous. Bella and Celeste, confused, watched their father wrap their mother in a sheet. They were not harmed at home. They were alive when he put them in the truck, forced to sit at the feet of their deceased mother for the 45-minute drive to the oil field. They were witnesses to their own abduction, driven to their final destination by their own father. The house on Saratoga Trail, the symbol of their perfect life, became a dark monument. It sat empty for years, a dark tourism site, as the bank foreclosed on it. It was eventually sold at auction, a home forever stained by the events that occurred within its walls. The case of Chris Watts resonates so deeply because it shatters our most fundamental assumptions. It attacks the very idea of family and safety. We are taught to fear the stranger in the alley, the monster under the bed. We are not taught to fear the loving father, the quiet husband, the man who smiles in family photos. Shanann Watts had built an entire world on social media, projecting an image of happiness and success. But the person she was projecting it with was a stranger, a man capable of a coldness that defied human comprehension. He didn't just want a divorce, he wanted an erasure. He wanted to wipe his entire family off the map so he could start over, unburdened by debt, unburdened by love, unburdened by his own children. The ultimate betrayal was not the affair, it was the calculation. It was the moment a father looked at his two beautiful, innocent daughters and saw them not as human beings to be cherished, but as problems to be solved. And the solution he chose was unthinkable. Boynton Beach, Florida. It is a world away from the cold, gray plains of the Midwest or the quiet, manicured suburbs of Colorado. This is a place built on sunshine, sand, and second chances. The air is thick with salt and humidity, and the landscape is a sprawl of pastel-colored strip malls, gated communities, and sprawling waterfront properties. It is a place where new money flows freely, and the line between legitimate success and hustling is often blurred by the blinding subtropical sun. People come here from all over the country and all over the world to reinvent themselves, to escape their pasts, and to stake their claim on the American dream, Florida style. In 2008, Michael Dippolito was one of those people. He was not a perfect man. He had a complicated past. He was a convicted con artist, having served time for fraud. He had lived a life in the gray areas, but now he was trying to go straight. He had some money, a new townhome in a nice community, and a desire to settle down, to find the stability he had never had. He was in his late 30s, and he thought he had finally found his chance at a normal, happy life. Then he met Dalia Muhammad. Dalia was striking. She was young, beautiful, and possessed a charm that was both disarming and intense. She had worked as an escort, a profession she was not open about, and she too was looking for a different kind of life. She was looking for security, for comfort, for the kind of lifestyle she felt she deserved. Their meeting was a collision of two people looking for a new start. The romance was a whirlwind, a Florida fairy tale. They met in the fall of 2008. Within months, they were inseparable. By February 2009, just a few months after their first encounter, they were married. Michael Dippolito felt like the luckiest man alive. He was married to a beautiful woman, living in a sun-drenched town with his past behind him. The honeymoon period had begun. Or so he thought. Almost immediately, the threads of this new life began to unravel, but Michael was too enamored to see it. Dalia began to express concern about his past, his legal troubles, his probation. She was worried, she said, that his past could come back to haunt him, that he could lose everything he had worked for. She presented herself as his protector, his partner in securing their future. She made a suggestion. Why didn't he put his assets in her name? Just temporarily, she insisted. It would protect his townhome, his money, from any legal seizures related to his old cases. Michael, deeply trusting his new bride, saw it as a sign of her commitment. He agreed. He signed over the deed to his townhome, placing it solely in Dalia's name. Dalia also knew about the cash. Michael, wary of banks because of his past, kept a significant amount of money, tens of thousands of dollars, in a safe inside the house. Dalia now had control of the house, and she knew where the money was. Within weeks of their wedding, Michael began to notice strange things. Dalia was secretive. She would take calls in other rooms, whispering. She had purchased a new laptop that she kept hidden. He also noticed that she was constantly bringing him tea, specifically a certain brand of iced tea. He would drink it and then feel inexplicably drowsy, sometimes sleeping for the entire day. He would wake up disoriented, his memory of the previous hours hazy. He chalked it up to stress. He didn't realize his wife was allegedly testing methods to incapacitate him. The motive was not complicated. It was the oldest one in the book: greed. Dalia had secured his assets. She had the house. She knew about the money. But she had a problem. If she divorced Michael, he would fight for his assets. Under Florida law, he would likely get at least half of everything, including the house he had owned before they even met. A divorce was messy, and it didn't guarantee her everything. Dalia Dippolito did not want a divorce. She wanted an erasure. Her search for a solution did not begin with a stranger. It began with an old flame, a man from her past named Mohammed Shahada. In the summer of 2009, just 5 months into her marriage, Dalia reconnected with Shahada. She began to confide in him, painting a dark, fabricated picture of her new life. She claimed Michael was abusive, that he was controlling, that she was terrified of him. It was a complete fiction, but it was a necessary one for her plan. She told Shahada that she couldn't take it anymore, that she wanted to be done with Michael. Shahada offered his sympathies, but Dalia's complaints quickly turned into something far more sinister. She wasn't just venting, she was probing. She asked him if he knew anyone who could help her. She wasn't subtle. She was looking for someone to take care of her husband, permanently. Mohammed Shahada was stunned. At first, he thought she was joking or just being overly dramatic. He tried to brush it off, but Dalia was persistent. She kept calling, texting. She started talking about specific methods, about acquiring a weapon. She asked him to help her find someone, a hitman. Shahada was now in a terrifying position. He realized she was dangerously real. He didn't want any part of this, but he was also terrified that if he simply said no, she would find someone else, and a man's life was on the line. He made a courageous, life-altering decision. He went to the Boynton Beach Police Department. He walked in and told the detectives on duty the entire sordid story. A newlywed wife was trying to hire a hitman to eliminate her husband. The detectives were skeptical, to say the least. This sounded like a plot from a bad movie, but they were obligated to investigate. The potential threat was too great to ignore. They asked Shahade if he would be willing to cooperate, to become a confidential informant. He agreed. The police wired him for sound and had him set up a meeting with Dalia. The plan was simple. Shahada would tell Dalia he had found a guy who was willing to do the job. That guy, of course, would be an undercover police officer. This is where the case transitions from a simple domestic conspiracy into one of the most surreal and infamous sting operations in American history. The Boynton Beach Police Department happened to be working with the reality TV show Cops. The producers were embedded with the department, filming their daily activities. When the detectives realized what they had on their hands, a real-life solicitation for a passing plot, they saw an opportunity. They would not only conduct a sting, they would capture every second of it on professional-grade video. They enlisted Officer Witty Jean, a calm, seasoned undercover operative. He would play the part of Mike, the supposed hitman. Shahada set up the meeting. He told Dalia his guy was in town and was willing to meet her. The location was set, a parking lot at a local convenience store. The stage was a simple, unmarked car, rigged with hidden cameras and microphones. Dalia agreed without hesitation. Officer Whitty Jean sat in the driver's seat, waiting. Dalia, wearing a white tank top and sunglasses perched on her head, pulled up and got into the passenger seat. She was not visibly nervous. She was not trembling. She was, astonishingly, all business. It was as if she were meeting a contractor to discuss a kitchen renovation. Whitty Jean, in his role as Mike, was professional. He was calm. He needed to get the evidence to confirm her intent beyond any doubt. "So," he began, "he tells me you're having some problems with your husband." Dalia launched into her well-rehearsed script. She claimed Michael was abusive, that he was on probation for fraud, that he controlled her every move. She painted herself as the victim, trapped in a terrible situation. Jean cut to the chase. "So, what's the plan? What do you want to happen?" "I want him gone," Dalia said, her voice clear. She discussed the details. She suggested a plan. Maybe it could look like a robbery gone wrong. She provided Jean with a photograph of Michael. She gave him his schedule, the layout of their home, the alarm codes, the fact that he went to the gym at the same time every morning. She was meticulous. She talked about his final day. She wanted it to happen on a specific Wednesday. She would be at the gym, her alibi. Jean, needing to lock down the case, needing to eliminate any possibility of a defensive entrapment or misunderstanding, posed the most important question of the entire operation. He looked at her, his voice even. "Are you sure you want to do this?" he asked. "You're 100% positive? When it's done, it's done. You can't change your mind." Dalia looked back at him. She did not flinch. She did not pause to think. Her response would become a permanent fixture in the true crime lexicon. "I'm not going to change my mind," she said, her voice flat and cold. "I am. I'm positive. I'm 5,000% sure." 5,000% sure. The words hung in the air, captured by every camera and microphone. It was the sound of pure, unadulterated intent. They discussed the price. Whitty Jean quoted her $7,000. Dalia agreed. She explained she would get the money from her husband's safe. She would steal money from Michael Dippolito to pay for his own elimination. A few days later, she met with Jean again to deliver the down payment. She handed over $1,200 in cash. The police now had it all: the solicitation, the intent, the financial transaction, all captured on crystal clear video. But they weren't done. The Boynton Beach Police Department, with the cops' cameras rolling, decided to see the sting through to its theatrical conclusion. They wanted to show Dalia the consequences of her actions. They wanted to capture her reaction when she believed her plan had succeeded. The date was set: Wednesday, August 5th, 2009. Early that morning, while Dalia was at the gym establishing her alibi, the police department set up a fake crime scene at the Dippolito townhome. They rolled out squad cars, forensic vans, and yellow crime scene tape. They cordoned off the entire area. It was a full-scale production. An officer then made the call. He phoned Dalia at the gym. In a somber voice, he informed her that there had been an incident at her home and she needed to return immediately. The cops' cameras were in position. They captured Dalia's car pulling up. She got out, her gym clothes on, a look of mild confusion on her face. An officer, playing his part, met her on the sidewalk. He walked her toward the yellow tape. "Ma'am," he said, "I'm sorry to have to tell you this. Your husband, he's perished." Dalia Dippolito, the aspiring actress, unleashed the performance of her life. She collapsed. Her body went limp as she fell into the officer's arms. A wail that sounded more like a shriek tore from her throat. "No, no, he's not! Oh my God, no!" She clutched the officer, sobbing, hyperventilating. It was dramatic. It was over the top. And to the trained detectives watching, it was completely, laughably false. There were no tears. Her eyes were dry. It was all sound and fury.
a performance for an audience of one, the police officer she was clinging to. The police, following protocol, told her they needed to take her to the station to get her statement. She was a grieving widow, after all. They put her in the back of a squad car, and she continued her performance, wailing and crying all the way to the station. She was placed in an interview room, a box of tissues conveniently on the table. For a while, she sat there, grieving. Then the tone shifted. The detectives began to ask pointed questions. And then the door opened. In walked Officer Windy Jean, not as Mike, the hitman.
He was in his full, immaculate Boynton Beach police uniform. Dalia's face froze. The wailing stopped. Her expression was one of pure, cold confusion. She stared at him, her brain visibly trying to process this impossible image. She looked, as one detective later said, like her hard drive just crashed. A lead detective entered the room. "Dalia, we need to talk," he said. "Your husband is fine. He's not gone. He's alive. We know what you did, Dalia. We know you hired someone to take his life." Dalia's defense mechanism kicked in. The confusion morphed into denial. "What? I don't know what you're talking about."
She started to cry again, but this time the performance was different. It was the panic of being caught. To make the point undeniable, they brought Michael Dippolito himself into the station. He confronted his wife. "Dalia, you tried to have me taken out? After everything? Why, Dalia? Why?" Dalia just stared, her face blank, before turning away and claiming she had no idea what was happening. But the game was over. The evidence was absolute. Dalia Dippolito was arrested for solicitation to commit a first-degree offense. The case became an immediate international media sensation. The videos were simply too compelling to be ignored. The cops' footage, the undercover parking lot meeting, the 5,000% shoreline, and above all, the video of her fake grief at the fake crime scene, it all went viral. She was dubbed the honeymoon hitman bride. The story was a tabloid dream, a sun-drenched Florida noir story that was almost too bizarre to be true. But Dalia's arrest was only the beginning of what would become a nearly decade-long legal circus. She hired a high-profile defense attorney, Michael Ufferman. They were faced with a mountain of seemingly insurmountable evidence. How do you defend a client who was caught on high-definition video, cold as ice, hiring a hitman? The answer: you construct a defense so audacious, so absurd, that it just might work. You claim the entire thing was a hoax. This was the defense strategy. They argued that Dalia, her husband Michael, and the informant Mohammed Shahada had all plotted this together. And the motive? To get on reality television. The defense argued that Michael Dippolito, a former con artist, was desperate for fame and money. He wanted to be a reality TV star. They claimed he and Dalia had concocted this entire hire a hitman plot, hoping to film it, post it on YouTube, and become famous. They argued that Dalia was just acting in the car with Officer Jean, that she was playing a part in a script Michael had written. They claimed Michael knew he was filming a show, and that Dalia was just his pawn, an aspiring actress going along with her husband's crazy scheme. It was, they argued, a desperate bid for fame that had gone horribly wrong when the police and the cops' TV show got involved and took it seriously. The first trial began in 2011. The prosecution presented its case, which was devastatingly simple. They just played the tapes. They played the 5,000% sure video for the jury. They played the audio of Dalia negotiating the price. They showed the footage of her fake grief. The prosecutor's closing argument was simple: just watch the video. The defense argued the hoax theory. They put Michael Dippolito on the stand and attacked his credibility, bringing up his past fraud conviction. They tried to paint him as a liar and a manipulator, and Dalia as his victim. The jury wasn't buying it. They watched the videos. They saw Dalia's cold, transactional demeanor. In May 2011, the jury found Dalia Dippolito guilty. She was sentenced to 20 years in prison. It seemed like a straightforward end. But this was a Florida legal case, and nothing was simple. Dalia appealed. And in 2014, an appellate court overturned her conviction. The reason was a technicality. The judge in the first trial had made a mistake during jury selection, failing to properly question a juror who had claimed to have been a victim of a similar crime. The conviction was thrown out. A new trial was ordered. Dalia Dippolito, after serving several years in prison, was released on house arrest to await her second trial. The second trial began in May 2016. Dalia, now a household name, was back in court. The prosecution presented the same evidence, the videos, the tapes. The defense, however, was re-energized. They hammered the hoax theory even harder. But they also added a new defense: police entrapment. They argued that the Boynton Beach Police Department, in their zeal to get good footage for the Cops TV show, had pushed Dalia into this. They argued that the informant, Shahade, had pressured her. They argued that Officer Jean had crossed a line, that the whole thing was a performance orchestrated by the police for ratings. This time, the strategy worked. The jury was hopelessly deadlocked. After days of deliberation, they came back 3-3. A mistrial was declared. It was a stunning, shocking victory for the defense. Dalia had been caught on camera, 5,000% sure, and she was, for now, free. The prosecution was furious. They had the videos. They had the intent. They refused to let her walk. They announced they would try her a third time. Dalia Dippolito's third trial began in the summer of 2017. This was her last stand. The prosecution, having learned from their mistakes, was more focused. They systematically and patiently dismantled the hoax theory. They showed the jury Dalia's secret text messages. They pointed out that if this was a hoax to get on TV, why was Dalia secretly recording her own conversations with Mohammed Shahada? Why was she buying secret cell phones? They asked the jury to use their common sense. Does her performance in the car look like acting? Does her fake grief at the crime scene look like part of a plan with her husband? Or does it look like the performance of a woman who genuinely believes her husband is gone and she is finally free and rich? The defense tried the same strategy: the hoax, the entrapment, the unreliable husband. But this time, the magic was gone. In July 2017, 8 years after her arrest, the jury found Dalia Dippolito guilty of solicitation to commit first-degree offenses. This time, the verdict would stick. At her sentencing, the judge was scathing. He had presided over the legal circus for years. He looked at Dalia and called her pure evil. He said her actions were cold and calculated, and that she had shown no remorse. He spoke of the chilling nature of her 5,000% sure comment. He sentenced her to 16 years in state prison. Dalia Dippolito was sent to the Lowell Correctional Institution in Florida. Her appeals were exhausted. Her story, however, remains a permanent part of the true crime landscape. It is a case that stands apart from the others. Unlike the dark, brutal acts of Pam Hupp or Chris Watts, this was a plot defined by its almost casual, transactional nature. It was a plot born of sunshine and entitlement. Dalia Dippolito was not a brooding, complex figure. She was, as the prosecution argued, a simple, greedy woman who saw her husband not as a person, but as a walking bank account. Michael Dippolito, the man at the center of the storm, moved on. He tried to reclaim his life, forever marked as the man who had to watch his own wife plot his demise on national television. He had survived his past as a con artist, only to be conned in the most intimate and dangerous way imaginable. The case serves as a bizarre, sun-drenched Florida noir, a story of a woman so blinded by her own greed and so confident in her own charm that she never stopped to think that the cameras might be rolling. She thought she was directing her own movie, where she would end up with the house, the money, and her freedom. But she had miscast her co-stars. The hitman was a cop, the informant was a man with a conscience, and her husband, the intended victim, was very much alive.
The ultimate betrayal was not one of passion or rage. It was one of cold, hard, reptilian calculation. For $7,000 and a townhome, she was 5,000% sure she was willing to trade her husband's life.